They say routine is comforting, but sometimes, it blinds you to what you've lost. Until something or someone unexpected steps into your life and shakes the very foundation of everything you thought was settled. The evening was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of the kitchen appliances as I rinsed the last of the dinner plates. The routine was familiar, comforting even, until the front door swung open, pulling me from my thoughts. My husband's voice echoed through the hallway, louder than necessary, carrying an unfamiliar edge. I dried my hands quickly, smoothing the front of my sweater in an old habit that had never quite faded. Stepping toward the entryway, I caught sight of him first, my husband, moving easily into the house, his shoes kicked off carelessly, his coat tossed over the nearest chair. But he was not alone. A tall figure followed, his silhouette sharp against the dim light of the hallway. At first, it was just a shape, broad-shouldered, upright, composed. Then he stepped forward, and I saw him clearly for the first time. Dark skin, smooth and unblemished, a strong jawline, and eyes that held something unreadable. A presence that filled the space effortlessly. My husband introduced him with casual ease, explaining that he was a new hire at the company, sharp and capable, someone to be trusted. The man, who I now knew as Daniel, acknowledged me with a polite nod and a calm, measured voice. There was warmth in the way he spoke, a kind of quiet confidence that made it impossible to look away. I forced a smile, offering hospitality as naturally as I always had. My hands found purpose in preparing coffee, a familiar ritual to distract myself. But something felt different. The steady rhythm of my life had not been interrupted in a long time, and yet, there it was, an unexpected shift, subtle yet impossible to ignore. As I moved through the kitchen, measuring coffee grounds and listening to the distant murmur of their conversation, my thoughts wandered. It had been years, decades, even, since I had felt a presence that stirred something unfamiliar within me. My life with my husband had settled into predictable patterns, comfortable but unremarkable. Mornings began with the same routine, evenings ended with discussions of finances, schedules, and plans for retirement. Love was still there, but it had long since quieted into something steady rather than consuming. And yet, in that moment, there was something about Daniel's presence that made me feel acutely aware of myself in a way I hadn't in years. I scolded myself for even noticing. It was ridiculous, inappropriate. But emotions didn't always follow logic. When I returned to the dining room, balancing a tray of coffee cups, I found them deep in discussion, numbers, projections, the kind of business talk that had long since faded into background noise for me. My husband, ever enthusiastic about his work, barely looked up. But Daniel did. His gaze met mine as I set down the cups, his expression unreadable but steady. A quiet moment, fleeting yet heavy with something unspoken. A shiver ran down my spine, not from fear, but from the realization that, for the first time in years, I felt seen. Not as a wife, not as a hostess, but as a woman. The evening stretched on in a blur of conversation that I barely followed. I sat apart, pretending to read, flipping through the pages of a magazine without registering a single word. My thoughts remained restless, looping back to the weight of that one moment. As my husband requested a snack, I seized the opportunity to step away, escaping to the kitchen under the guise of hospitality. Leaning against the counter, I pressed cool hands to my flushed cheeks, trying to shake off the strange sensation that had settled deep in my chest. This was nothing. A passing thought. A brief moment of awareness that would fade with time. And yet, as I returned to the room, placing the bowl of pretzels on the table, Daniel's gaze lingered once more. He spoke casually, commenting on the warmth of the home, the way everything felt thoughtfully arranged. My husband chuckled, attributing it to my endless habit of rearranging furniture, barely noticing the way Daniel's words seemed directed at me rather than the space itself. The night eventually wound down, and as Daniel prepared to leave, I found myself following them to the door. My husband, ever the gracious host, patted his back and spoke of future meetings, making plans without a second thought. Daniel turned to me one last time, offering a polite farewell, his voice steady and warm. And then he was gone, walking down the driveway with an ease that left an imprint long after he disappeared from sight. As my husband locked the door and kissed my cheek, murmuring thanks for putting up with the evening, I offered a weak smile. I climbed into bed beside him, yet my mind refused to settle. For the first time in years, I wondered what it felt like to be noticed again. And that thought refused to leave me. The days that followed unfolded like an echo, their rhythm unchanged yet tinged with something unspoken. The house remained the same, the routines continued, but beneath it all, a quiet shift had settled into my thoughts. Daniel had left an imprint on my mind, his presence lingering in ways I struggled to rationalize. I told myself it was nothing, just a fleeting moment of awareness, a distraction from the predictability of my days. And yet, I caught myself anticipating the possibility of his return, wondering if my husband would mention his name in passing. It didn't take long. The following Tuesday, as the sun dipped below the horizon, my husband mentioned over dinner that Daniel would be joining him again that evening. His voice carried the same casual ease as before, unaware of the way my pulse quickened at the mention of his name. I went about tidying the kitchen, occupying my hands to ignore the growing awareness inside me. When the knock finally came at the door, my husband greeted him with the same familiarity as before, ushering him inside as though he were already part of our world. I kept my movements measured, deliberate. As I emerged from the kitchen, my expression composed. Daniel stood in the entryway, his posture relaxed but assured. There was nothing overt in the way he looked at me, no indication that he remembered the quiet moment we had shared days before. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that he did. As the evening stretched on, I remained on the periphery, observing more than engaging. My husband carried the conversation, his voice weaving through business matters and future projects. Daniel listened, nodded, contributed where necessary, but every so often, his gaze flickered toward me, brief glances that left a trail of heat in their wake. It was an unsettling realization, the way a presence could make you more aware of yourself. The way a single glance could remind you of something long forgotten. When I offered coffee, my hands were steady, my voice neutral. But as I placed the cup before him, our fingers brushed, a moment too brief to be called anything, yet potent enough to send a shiver through me. I withdrew quickly, stepping back before my husband could notice, but Daniel's gaze lingered for a second longer than necessary. I returned to my place, pretending to busy myself with trivial tasks, but the awareness had already settled deep. It was not an attraction in the traditional sense, not a yearning for something physical. It was the realization that I was being seen in a way I had not been seen in years. By the time the night drew to a close, my husband once again extended an invitation for another meeting later in the week. Daniel accepted easily, shaking his hand before turning to me with that same polite warmth. "Thank you," he said simply, his voice even. I nodded, offering a small smile, but my mind was elsewhere, already caught in the delicate pull of something unnamed. As I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling while my husband's breath evened beside me, I realized something unsettling. I was waiting for him to come back. The days stretched into weeks, each one carrying a quiet shift in the air, a change so subtle that I almost convinced myself it wasn't happening. And yet, I knew better. My awareness of Daniel had become something I could no longer ignore. It started with the smallest of things. The way my heart quickened when my husband mentioned his name, the way my breath caught when I heard the knock at the door, knowing it was him. I kept telling myself that it was nothing, an innocent curiosity, a fleeting sense of liveliness brought on by the presence of someone new. But the more I tried to push the thought away, the more persistent it became. Daniel began appearing in my days in ways I hadn't expected. A passing comment he had made would echo in my mind as I went about my routine. A brief glance exchanged over the rim of a coffee cup would replay itself as I lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling. My world had not changed, yet my perception of it had. One evening, after yet another visit that played out like the others, my husband talking, Daniel listening, me hovering at the edges, I found myself doing something I hadn't done in years. I reached for my phone, hesitated, then typed a message. "I hope my husband isn't making you work too hard." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the send button. It was a harmless message, nothing that could be misinterpreted. And yet, I hesitated. Finally, before I could overthink it, I pressed send. The response came almost instantly. "Never too hard. He's a good boss. And you're a generous hostess." I swallowed, rereading his words, searching for something more beneath their surface. It was polite, professional even. But I felt it, an undercurrent, something unspoken but present. After that, the messages became more frequent. At first, they were brief, always related to my husband's work, something about a meeting, a request for clarification on a document. But slowly, they shifted. "How's your evening?" "A bit quiet tonight." "And yours?" "Same. Just finishing up some reports." "I imagine you work hard. You seem like the type who doesn't stop until the job is done." His response had come with a hint of amusement. "Is that how you see me?" I stared at the words, my heart pounding, before typing back. "I see you as someone who pays attention." That was the moment when I realized it had already begun, this slow, quiet pull that neither of us had named but both of us had acknowledged. It wasn't a confession, nor was it an outright invitation. But it was enough. The days continued, our interactions woven carefully between the expected and the unsaid. My husband remained oblivious, his focus on work, his routine unchanged. And yet, my own routine had shifted entirely. I found myself looking at my phone more often, waiting for the next message. I felt a flicker of anticipation whenever my husband mentioned another evening with Daniel. And when those evenings came, I stole glances when I thought no one was looking, lingering a second too long when I handed him a cup of coffee. Nothing had happened. And yet, everything had. I was playing with something dangerous, something that had no name but carried weight. And the worst part was that I didn't want to stop. The turning point was inevitable. The quiet tension, the stolen glances, the messages that carried more meaning than their words let on, all of it had built toward something that neither of us had spoken aloud. That Friday morning, my husband left early for a meeting out of town. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, I felt it, that weightless, electric anticipation that had become so familiar. I hesitated only briefly before picking up my phone. "Are you busy today?" The response came quickly, as if he had been waiting. "Not at the moment." "Do you need something?" I swallowed, my heart beating too fast as I typed my reply. "Come by. Just for a little while." There was a pause, just long enough for doubt to creep in. Then his answer came. "I'll be there soon." The weight was unbearable. I found myself pacing the house, straightening pillows, adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. I told myself there was no harm in this. Just a visit. A conversation. Nothing had to happen. When the knock finally came, I had to take a breath before opening the door. And there he was, standing on my porch, his presence filling the space between us. He stepped inside without a word, and I closed the door behind him. For a long moment, we just stood there. The house was too quiet, the air too thick with things unsaid. I motioned toward the living room, and we moved together, the distance between us careful but fragile. We talked, at first. Simple things. Work, plans for the weekend, the kind of small talk that barely masked the tension humming beneath it. And then, as I reached for my coffee cup, my hand trembled slightly. He noticed. His gaze lingered on my fingers before lifting to meet mine, something unreadable in his expression. "You sure about this?" he asked, his voice low, steady. I should have said no. I should have laughed it off, shifted the moment back to safer ground. Instead, I held his gaze and nodded. The space between us disappeared in an instant. His hand found mine, warm and firm, grounding me even as everything else felt weightless. The first touch was tentative, as if we both needed permission for what was happening. But then, as I leaned into him, as his breath brushed against my cheek, hesitation melted away. Time unraveled. There was no past, no future, just the sharp intensity of the present. Every touch, every moment, felt inevitable, as if we had been walking toward this for months without realizing it. But even in the haze of it, reality loomed in the back of my mind. The sound of a car door slamming outside sent a jolt of panic through me. I pulled back abruptly, my breath ragged, my hands shaking. He understood instantly. We didn't need words. Without another glance, he moved toward the back door, disappearing as quickly as he had arrived. I stood there for a moment, my heart hammering against my ribs, my hands still trembling. And then, slowly, I straightened my sweater, smoothed my hair, and walked toward the front door, opening it just as my husband stepped inside. He smiled at me, oblivious. "Hey, everything okay?" I forced a smile, nodding. "Of course. Just another quiet day." But it wasn't. Not anymore. The weight of what had happened lingered in the days that followed. Every glance at my phone, every quiet moment alone, felt charged with a new awareness. I had crossed a threshold, and there was no undoing it. My husband carried on as usual, oblivious to the change in me. He spoke of work, of upcoming plans, of things that once held my interest but now felt distant. I answered when required, nodded at the right times, but my mind was elsewhere. Daniel did not text me, and I did not text him. The silence was its own kind of torment, a reminder of what had nearly happened and what still might. Then, one evening, my husband came home with an unexpected smile. "Daniel's coming by," he said, shrugging off his coat. "Thought we'd go over a few things before the next meeting." I froze, gripping the counter a little too tightly. "Tonight?" "Yeah, shouldn't take too long." He moved toward the living room, completely unaware of the storm raging inside me. I tried to prepare myself, but nothing could have steadied me when the knock came at the door. I opened it slowly, and there he was, calm, composed, as if nothing had changed. And yet, in the way his gaze met mine, I knew he felt it too. My husband greeted him warmly, leading him inside, into our home, into my space. I moved on autopilot, offering drinks, pretending that my hands weren't shaking. The conversation between them blurred into background noise as I sat quietly, my thoughts tangled. Then, at one point, I felt it. A glance. Quick but deliberate. The slightest shift in his posture, an unspoken acknowledgement of what lingered between us. I swallowed hard, willing my heart to steady itself. The evening passed, minutes stretching endlessly. When it was finally time for Daniel to leave, my husband clapped him on the back, making some casual remark that I barely registered. And then, just as Daniel stepped toward the door, he hesitated just long enough for his hand to brush mine as I passed him his coat. The touch was fleeting, but it sent a rush through me, a confirmation that neither of us had forgotten. Then he was gone. I stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, feeling the weight of it all. The tension, the longing, the unsaid words that filled the space between us. That night, as I lay in bed beside my husband, I realized something undeniable. This wasn't over. Not even close.